September 28, 1945. 14 hours. Office of Naval Intelligence, Annex, Yokosuka, Japan. The room smelled of stale coffee and the sharp chemical tang of mimeograph ink, a scent entirely alien to the smoldering ruins of the city outside. Emiko Sato sat rigid on a metal folding chair, her hands trembling slightly in her lap, trying to hide the frayed cuffs of her mampe trousers. Across the steel desk, Lieutenant Commander Harris didn't look like a demon. He looked bored. Between them lay a grid of paper, covered in red and blue grease pencil markings. It wasn't just a map, it was a frequency chart. Her frequency chart from the Kure Naval District. Harris tapped a specific column with the eraser end of his pencil. The 5-digit additive group here, on August 14th, he said, his voice flat, mediated by a Nisei translator whose Japanese was jarringly formal. You shifted to the backup cipher table row 6 hours early. Why? The breath caught in Emiko's throat. The hum of the electric fan in the corner seemed to roar. That shift was a mistake she had made in panic during an air raid. It was never transmitted officially. It was a ghost signal. How? She whispered, the word cracking. That was inside the room. Just us. Harris flipped the page, revealing a photocopy of her own handwritten logbook. We were in the room with you, Miss Sato. We've been in the room for 2 years. The terrifying realization hit her like a physical blow. The Americans hadn't just outfought them, they had known them. If you enjoy deep dives into history's hidden moments, consider subscribing and commenting which theater of WP01 interests you most. 2 weeks earlier, United States Detention Camp 4, outside Yokohama. September 14th, 1945. US Detention Camp 4, near Yokohama. The rain did not wash things clean. It only turned the ash and topsoil into a gray, clinging paste that coated everything. Emiko Sato pulled her knees to her chest, trying to preserve the small pocket of warmth between her torso and her thighs. She sat on a wooden crate inside the canvas tent, surrounded by 30 other women. Most were silent. Some wept softly. Emiko fixed her eyes on the mud caking her jikatabi, split-toed rubber shoes she had scavenged from a depot 2 days before the surrender. If she looked down, she wouldn't have to see the tall, looming shadows pacing outside the tent flap. They are looking for comfort women, a woman next to her whispered, clutching a bundle of rags. That's what they say. Or typists to work in the mines. Quiet, Emiko hissed, though her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Don't give them a reason. The tent flap was thrown back roughly. The gray light of the afternoon spilled in, silhouetting a massive figure. An American MP, wearing a white helmet liner that gleamed unnaturally in the gloom, ducked inside. He held a clipboard shielded by plastic. He didn't look like the monsters. From the posters, the ones with fangs and horns, he looked well-fed. That was almost more terrifying. Sato? The man's voice was loud, butchering the pronunciation. Emiko Sato? Emiko stopped breathing. The silence in the tent was absolute. To be named was to be doomed. She felt the collective gaze of the other women shifting away from her, a silent, terrified ostracization. I was just a clerk, she told herself. I just transcribed numbers. Sato! The MP barked again, scanning the huddle. She stood up slowly. Her legs felt like water. Hi, she whispered, then corrected herself. Here. The MP looked her up and down, checking a photograph attached to his clipboard. It was her ID photo from the Kure Naval District, taken 3 years ago when she still had cheeks, before the rations were cut. Let's go, the MP said, gesturing with a thumb over his shoulder. Intel wants a word. She stepped out into the rain. A Willys Jeep sat idling, its engine purring with a mechanical health that no Japanese vehicle had possessed for months. As she climbed into the back seat, water soaking instantly through her thin cotton shirt, She didn't look back at the tent. She gripped the cold metal frame of the seat. They knew who she was. The anonymity of defeat was over. The Jeep ride was a blur of motion that felt illicit. For years, gasoline had been blood. To burn it so freely on a single prisoner felt like a sin. The vehicle rumbled through the gates of the Yokosuka Naval Base, past rows of corrugated steel Quonset huts that had sprung up like strange silver mushrooms among the traditional tiled roofs of the surviving administrative buildings. The MP escorted Emiko out of the rain and into a long hallway. The transition was violent. Outside, the world was gray, wet, and smelling of ash. Inside, the air was dry and smelled intensely of floor wax and tobacco. Rich, sweet Virginia tobacco, not the harsh wood chip filler she was used to. She kept her head down, her eyes fixed on the MP's polished boots reflecting the overhead lights. The lights hummed, a steady, unblinking electric glare. In Kura, the power had cut out daily for months. Here, electricity seemed as abundant as the air. "Sit here," the MP said, pointing to a wooden bench outside a frosted glass door. He walked away, leaving her unguarded. Emiko sat on the edge of the bench, her hands clamping her knees to stop them from shaking. She looked at the trash bin next to her. It was overflowing with paper. White, crisp, high-quality bond paper. Some sheets had only a few lines of typing before being crumpled and discarded. She felt a sudden, nauseating wave of vertigo. Her unit had been reusing the backs of propaganda flyers for log sheets since 1944. The Americans threw away paper cleaner than anything she had written on in her life. The door opened. A man in a khaki uniform stepped out. He wore no sidearm. His collar bore the gold oak leaves of a lieutenant. "Commander." He looked tired, rubbing his eyes with one hand while holding a porcelain mug in the other. He stopped when he saw her. He didn't shout. He didn't reach for a weapon. "Sato-san?" he asked. His accent was thick, American, but understandable. Emiko stood up, bowing reflexively, a conditioned response she hated herself for immediately. "Hi." The officer gestured to the open door. "Come in. It's warmer in here." She stepped across the threshold. The room was dominated by steel filing cabinets and a large desk cluttered with folders. But it was the smell that arrested her. It wasn't just tobacco. It was coffee. Real, roasted coffee. The aroma was so strong, so reminiscent of a life before the war, that it made her mouth water and her stomach cramp simultaneously. "I am Lieutenant Commander Harris," he said, moving behind the desk. He didn't sit down immediately. Instead, he picked up a second mug from a side table, poured dark liquid from a glass percolator, and set it on the edge of the desk near her. "Black?" he asked. "We're out of sugar." Emiko stared at the steam rising from the cup. This was the torture, she realized. Not bamboo slivers or waterboarding. It was this, showing her the universe of comfort that had crushed them, and asking her to drink it. Emiko did not touch the coffee. To drink it would be to accept a gift, and to accept a gift was to incur a debt. She placed her hands flat on her thighs, staring straight ahead, avoiding the eyes of the second man who had quietly entered the room. He was younger, perhaps 25, with Japanese features, but an American uniform, a Nisei, a traitor by blood in her eyes. He stood by the window, holding a notebook, his posture relaxed in a way no Japanese soldier's ever was. "My name is Kenji," the young man said. His Japanese was fluent, but archaic, the language of a grandmother, lacking the sharp, militaristic slang of the 1940s. "The commander wishes to discuss your work at the Kure District Communications Center." "I was a clerk," Emiko recited the lie she had rehearsed in the dark tent. "I filed requisition forms for socks and rice." Harris didn't wait for the translation. He seemed to understand the tone, if not the words. He walked to a table in the corner, covered by a gray canvas tarp. With a deliberate, unhurried motion, He pulled the cover back. Emiko flinched. Sitting on the steel table, stripped of its wooden travel case, was a Type 94 Mark VI wireless set. The black bakelite dials were dull under the fluorescent lights. The brass telegraph key, usually polished to a shine by the operator's sweat and oil, looked naked. It was the machine she had spent 3 years of her life married to. She knew the resistance of that specific key spring. She knew the way the frequency drift dial felt when the humidity rose. Seeing it here, unplugged and captive in this American office, felt obscene, like seeing a family member's corpse on display. Harris walked over and rested his hand on the transmitter. His fingers were large, clumsy compared to the delicate touch required for high-speed transmission, but he moved with familiarity. He flipped the power toggle. The distinct thwack of the switch echoed in the silent room. "We recovered this from a submarine pen in I-400, Harris said, Kenji translating rapidly. "The vacuum tubes are still warm, but we don't need you to tell us how to turn it on, Sato-san." He picked up a piece of paper from the desk, a carbon copy of a radio intercept log. "We need to talk about the barn, the chatter." Harris tapped the paper. "You have a very distinctive fist, Miss Sato. You dwell on your DAWs just a fraction of a second longer than the manual prescribes, especially when you are tired." Emiko's blood ran cold. The fist, the unique rhythmic signature of a telegraph operator, was like a fingerprint. "I don't know what you mean," she said, her voice trembling. Harris looked at her, not with anger, but with a terrifying academic curiosity. "We've been listening to you personally since 1943. We know about the shift changes. We know when you had the flu in February because your transmission rate dropped by 4 groups a minute." He leaned forward, bracing his hands on the desk. "We aren't here to ask what you sent. We know what you sent. We want to know why the procedure changed on August 14th. "Coincidence," Emiko said, the word tasting like ash. "Many operators have heavy hands. It proves nothing." Harris didn't argue. He didn't even look up. He simply reached into a drawer and pulled out a large, folded sheet of vellum paper. He spread it over the desk, smoothing the creases with a heavy, deliberate hand. It was a grid, a timeline. "August 1st, Harris said, pointing to a column marked in blue grease pencil. "Message priority, urgent. Origin, Cure. Destination, Sasebo. You used the fleet indicator, Roha 99. Emiko's eyes betrayed her before she could stop them. They widened, just a fraction. Roha 99 was the specific routing code for the heavy cruiser tone. It was a secret within a secret, changed monthly, sometimes weekly. "We knew the tone was in port for boiler repairs," Harris continued, his voice devoid of triumph, merely stating facts like a weather report. "But you routed the traffic as if she were at sea. Deception traffic. Fake signals to make us think the fleet was active." He looked up at her then. "We ignored it, Sato-san. We knew it was fake because you forgot to add the padding characters at the end of the transmission block. A warship at sea always adds padding to mask the message length. You sent it clean, like a clerk sitting in a warm office." Emiko felt the blood drain from her face. It wasn't just that they had broken the code. They had analyzed the texture of the lie. They understood the bureaucracy of the Imperial Navy better than the officers who commanded it. "The code," she stammered, speaking Japanese now, forgetting the interpreter. "The additives. There are 40,000 pages of random numbers. It is statistically impossible." Kenji translated, his voice soft. "She says it is impossible." Harris picked up the red grease pencil. He drew a circle around a cluster of numbers on the chart. "Not random, Miss Sato. Your additives were generated by a machine, but the machine had a bias. And your officers, they were lazy. They reused the pages from the previous month because they didn't want to burn new code books. He pushed the chart toward her. It was a dissection of her life's work. Every late night, every frantic transmission during an air raid, every desperate attempt to serve the Emperor, reduced to a statistical error in an American logbook. "We didn't beat you with magic," Harris said quietly. "We beat you with arithmetic." Emiko looked at the chart. The lines of red and blue crossed and intersected, forming a cage. She wasn't a prisoner of the detention camp anymore. She was a prisoner of this grid. Harris walked to the wall and pulled down a roller map. It wasn't a map of Japan as Emiko knew it, a dragon-shaped archipelago. It was a grid of ocean marked with aggressive black arcs converging on a single point south of Kyushu. "April 6th, Harris said. "The Yamato sortie, the suicide mission." Emiko stiffened. That day was sacred. The great battleship, the pride of the combined fleet, sailing out with only enough fuel for a one-way trip to Okinawa. It was the ultimate expression of the Empire's resolve. "We maintained radio silence," she said, her voice tight. "Total silence. The fleet did not transmit a single signal after leaving the Bungo Strait." "The fleet was silent," Harris corrected gently. "But you were not." He tapped a location on the map. Kure, the base where Emiko sat. On the morning of April 6th, the volume of administrative traffic from Kure to the fleet commanders spiked by 400%, Harris explained. Kenji translated the technical terms with brutal clarity. "You were sending supply manifests, personnel transfers, last will and testaments. You were clearing the decks." Harris picked up a plotting ruler. "We didn't need to read the codes to know something was happening, Sato-san. We call it traffic analysis. When the ants start running fast, we know the hill is about to break." He traced a line from Kure to the open ocean. "Your transmitter, the one you operated, was the beacon. Every time you keyed down to send a silent order, our direction-finding stations in Guam and the Philippines triangulated the source. We knew the Yamato was leaving before the first anchor was weighed. We knew because you told us." Emiko stared at the black lines on the map. She remembered that day, the exhaustion, the pride she felt typing the messages, feeling like she was part of the great wind pushing the ship forward. She had tapped the keys with vigor, pouring her spirit into the machine. And the Americans had been listening to the static, measuring the intensity of her work to aim their torpedo bombers. The room spun. The divine wind hadn't failed because the gods were deaf. It failed because the enemy had better ears. She hadn't protected the fleet. She had painted a target on it. She couldn't finish the sentence. The nausea was real now, rising in her throat. Harris sat down on the edge of the desk, crossing his arms. The casualness of the pose was gone. He looked at her with a sudden, sharp intensity. "We tracked the Yamato to the bottom of the sea using your radio waves," he said. "But on August 14th, the day before the Emperor spoke, you did something different. You broke the pattern. That is what we don't understand." "August 14th, Harris repeated. He slid a single sheet of paper across the metal desk. 1400 hours. Tokyo time. Emiko looked down. The paper was a standard US Navy intercept form, typed in crisp purple ink, but the content was a string of 5-digit groups, Japanese naval code, 88921 440112 67339. She felt a phantom heat on her skin. August 14th. The bunker in Kure had been 40 degrees Celsius, the ventilation system failing as the B-29s pounded the harbor above. The air had been thick with the acrid smoke of burning paper. They had been ordered to prepare the burn bags, weighted canvas sacks filled with code books, ready to be thrown into the harbor if the Americans landed. "The message is gibberish," Harris said. "We tried the standard additive tables. We tried the reserve tables. We even ran it through the IBM machines in Pearl Harbor, assuming it was a transposition error. Nothing." He leaned in close. "But the header, The header indicates a switch to cipher table row. That table wasn't scheduled for implementation until September 1st. Why did you switch early? Was it a signal to the submarines? A final stand order? Emiko stared at the numbers. The room in Yokosuka faded. She was back in the tunnel. The lights were flickering. Lieutenant Tanaka was shouting, waving his pistol, his eyes wild with fear and exhaustion. He had passed out small glass vials. Cyanide. Take it if they breach the door, he had screamed. Her hands had been shaking so badly she could barely hold the pencil. She had grabbed the book on the left. The wrong book. It wasn't a signal, she whispered. It was sent on the command frequency. Harris pressed, his voice hardening. If there are rogue units out there waiting for a confirmed code based on this table, we need to know. The war is over, Sato-san. Don't let more men die for a mistake. It was a mistake, Emiko snapped, the outburst startling even herself. She looked up at Harris, her eyes burning. There was no strategy. There was no final stand. The ventilation was broken. We were suffocating. The officer was handing out poison. She pointed a trembling finger at the 5-digit groups. I didn't switch to table row because of an order. I switched because I dropped the current code book into the fire barrel by accident. I grabbed the only book left on the shelf so I could keep transmitting. I was terrified the lieutenant would shoot me if I stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. The hum of the electric fan seemed to stop. Harris looked at the paper, then at Kenji, then back at Emiko. The terrifying, omniscient intelligence officer looked confused. You burned the code book? Harris asked slowly. By accident? Yes, Emiko said, tears finally spilling over, hot and shameful. I was scared. I just wanted to look busy. I typed nonsense numbers from the wrong book so the officer wouldn't kill me. The great American intelligence machine, which had tracked battleships and predicted invasions, had been stalled by a terrified girl trying to look busy in a burning room. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the hum of the fluorescent lights. Harris stared at Emiko, his mouth slightly open. The terrifying image of the fanatical Japanese soldier, fighting to the last breath, collided violently with the image of the trembling woman in front of him, admitting she had compromised a national code because she was afraid of her own lieutenant. Harris sat down slowly behind his desk. He didn't yell. He didn't call the MPs. He picked up the pencil again, flipping it end over end in his fingers. Table row, he muttered to himself. He pulled a thick binder from a shelf behind him, a captured Japanese code book, its cover scorched but legible. He flipped to the pages marked for September 1st. He looked at the intercept transcript, the August 14th message. He performed a quick calculation on a scrap of paper, subtracting the additives from the ciphertext. It was the manual grunt work of cryptography, usually done by teams of waves in Washington, but he needed to see it with his own eyes. Emiko watched him, her breathing shallow. She felt drained, hollowed out. The secret she had carried, her professional shame, her cowardice, was now raw data on his desk. Harris finished the calculation. He stared at the result. Then a strange sound escaped his throat, a dry, barking chuckle. Kenji, Harris said, sliding the scratch pad to the translator. Read that. Kenji squinted at the kanji characters Harris had derived. Mountain, river, mountain, rice, mountain. He looked up, bewildered. It's nonsense, sir. Just random words. Harris looked at Emiko. The cold, predatory look was gone, replaced by something that looked perilously like pity. You weren't sending a command, Harris said. You were typing what you saw out the window? Or on a poster? A calendar, Emiko whispered, wiping her eyes with the back of her dirty hand. There was a calendar on the wall of the bunker, a landscape painting. I just typed what I saw. To keep the rhythm. To keep the officer from shooting me. Harris leaned back in his chair, the metal springs squeaking loudly. He rubbed his face with his hands. God damn it, he sighed. But there was no malice in it. We've had analysts in Pearl Harbor awake for 3 weeks trying to figure out if Mountain River was a code for a submarine wolf pack rendezvous. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a soft pack of Lucky Strikes. He tapped one out, not for himself, but extended the pack toward Emiko. Take it, he said. Emiko hesitated. To smoke in front of a superior officer, even an enemy one, was unthinkable. But the rules of the Empire were dead. The code books were burned. She took the cigarette. Her fingers were still stained with the ink of the detention camp processing. Harris struck a match and held the flame out. She leaned in, the sulfur flaring briefly, illuminating the space between them. The missing variable, Harris said, blowing a cloud of blue smoke toward the ceiling. We can calculate the frequency, the pitch, the additives, and the atmospheric distortion, but we couldn't calculate the fear. He looked at her through the haze. You aren't a war criminal, Sato-san. You're just a human being who got caught in the gears. The smoke filled Emiko's lungs, harsh and unfamiliar, but it tasted like something she hadn't felt in years. Reality. The demon across the desk wasn't a demon. He was just a tired man who was relieved he didn't have to hunt for submarines that didn't exist. Harris signed a paper on his desk. The sound of the pen scratching against the starch-stiffened bond paper seemed incredibly loud. He handed the slip to the MP who had been waiting outside the glass. You're cleared, Sato-san, Harris said, not looking up, already pulling a fresh file from the stack. General population, no war crimes, just don't apply for a radio operator job anytime soon. It was a joke, a dry American joke. Emiko didn't smile, but she bowed. A deeper, more genuine bow than the one she had offered upon entering. It wasn't a bow of submission to a conqueror. It was a bow of respect to a worthy adversary. She walked out of the office, past the humming electric fans and the smell of brewing coffee, back into the corridor. The MP led her outside. The shock of the afternoon air was instant. The humidity of Japan clamped onto her like a wet wool blanket. The smell of the high-octane American gasoline mixed with the pervasive, rotting scent of the mud and the charred timber of the ruins. She climbed back into the Jeep. The rain had stopped, but the sky was a bruised purple. As the vehicle lurched forward, navigating the cratered streets of Yokosuka, Emiko looked out at the devastation. For months, she had looked at these ruins and told herself it was a spiritual test. She had believed that if they just had enough Yamato Damashi, enough spirit, the firebombs wouldn't matter. She had believed the Americans were clumsy barbarians, flailing blindly with their machines. She looked down at her hands, resting on her knees, the hands that had typed thousands of messages, the hands that had, in her panic, typed Mountain River and confused the entire Pacific Fleet intelligence network. She thought of the grid on Harris's desk. The red and blue lines, the grease pencil marks that had tracked her life, her fear, and her friends' deaths with the indifference of an accountant balancing a ledger. The Americans weren't barbarians. They were architects. They hadn't just burned the cities, they had dismantled the Empire's soul, piece by piece, number by number, before they even dropped the first bomb. The Jeep slowed as it approached the detention camp gates. The muddy tents came into view, a miserable sea of canvas. But Emiko didn't feel the same dread she had felt an hour ago. The monsters she had feared didn't exist. There were only men with charts, and a world that no longer had room for secrets. She stepped out of the Jeep, her boots sinking into the familiar mud. She took a breath. It tasted of ash, but for the first time in years, the air felt clear. The war was over. The numbers had finally stopped.